Next speaker, who is Chris Mason, using the EMR. Chris, I don't have a bio for you, so you might just want to introduce yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello everyone, my name's Chris Mason. I am an intensivist at the Alfred Hospital, which is my first post-training job, and I kind of walked in on my first day and got asked to be involved in the EMR rollout. And so what I'd like to share with you is really therapy. We're now almost exactly 12 months since we rolled out the EMR within the ICU, and I thought that it was a good time for me to reflect on what we did, what we would do differently, and kind of have a therapy session with 100 scary experts of my field about what we could do as a group heading forwards. So really, I'm in the program as using the EMR, but it's actually really the other way. It's how to design a usable EMR. And I'm going to talk about the concept of MVP shortly as well. In the field of acronyms in which I work, ETQC was the name of the project that was rolling out the new electronic medical record across Alfred Health. Now, it is a Cerner electronic medical record, but I'm not going to be speaking specifically about any particular product, although I'm very happy to answer questions later on about how Cerner operates. I think really the guiding principles were really important to set up early as part of the project, particularly in relation to our patients and families. And so this slide was shown during every design session that we went through, and every time we presented it, our designs to anyone, because I think what happens a lot with EMRs is that they become a bit like a Christmas tree. They become filled with different aims from different people, and it's very hard to then reconcile those aims later on. And I can tell you that 12 months into using the EMR within our ICU, the primary issue that we have to deal with is dealing with all of these competing problems. So I'm going to go through philosophy to begin with, and then I'm going to talk about some practical changes of how things have operated within our unit and what I would recommend to others. So why have an EMR? We have an EMR to look after the patient in front of us. And while that is a fairly obvious thing to say, everyone coming into every design session is going to have a different concept of what the EMR is designed for. And my argument at the moment is that the more we do these ancillaries, the less we can look after the patients. So for example, an EMR is not a primary data collection tool. It is not a replacement for protocols. It is not there to train your staff in how to look after the patient. It is there to support the care of an individual patient. All of those other things may come along, but until you get that primary focus correct, everything else will seem confused. Another thing that I learnt very early on when in a lot of meetings with vendors is that they use the word solution a lot. By that they mean product, and that is universal across the tech industry. I have not seen or heard of a solution that does not come with its own problems. And Cerner certainly has its own. And what I've found is a lot of people coming and asking me about why we chose that particular product, why we don't design things in-house, or why we don't buy other products. The answer is that there is no single product that is going to get everything that you need. And a lot of that is because of the expectations that we come into when we are implementing an EMR. So Alfred ICU is a big ICU, with 45 beds at the time. In October of last year, we were at very high occupancy and very high acuity, with many extracorporeal life support patients, many specialty therapies. So we've, over the last number of years, massively increased our cardiothoracic output, as well as we were having a little flurry of transplants at the time. As well as we have all of our other state services. So when it comes to the ICU care that we deliver a very broad range of therapies with a very large cohort of staff. And so you can imagine that we have a lot of things that we need to think about when implementing the EMR, and training needed to be at the forefront of our mind. So go live is the easy part. So it is almost exactly, so it's 1 year next week. And we were all very wound up in the go-live period. And if any of you have implemented an EMR, you know that it's a very exciting time and also quite a scary time as you wait for, God forbid, attributable deaths to come in. but the resistance of your colleagues and the fact that it's a very stressful time for them while they're also delivering care. Now, I worked with an amazing team of doctors and nurses when we went live, and go live was definitely the easy part. It was what we're all familiar with, crisis resource management. And therefore, we had everything simmed before we went in. We had whiteboards, we had extra staff, we ran it really, really well. I think I was the most stressed out person there, but it was like a good resus, how there's not a lot of noise. It felt very calm. The last picture there is me when I went home afterwards. But it's the week after go live where the problems start to happen. And everyone is very focused on the bug fixes. So if I go live and there is something missing or something doesn't work, how do I get that fixed? And again, I can tell you that is the easy part, because there are usually additional staff and additional attention that come along with a go live and that stick around for a period of time afterwards. We found many bugs that were usually solved within an hour. That was not our biggest problem. Redesign is the hard part. And that's where we are still dealing at the moment. So all of the design decisions that you made 2 years out of go live, or 1 year out of go live, or even 1 month out of go live, and that you think you've tested every way that you possibly can, will be found wanting. Once you have real people working in the system whose training was 8 weeks ago and they can remember a little bit of it, but not much. And they start coming up with what the workflow will be, not what the workflow should be. And so as much process engineering as we put in advance, we immediately saw what the flaws were once we had someone who had nothing to do with it pointed out. Now, despite the fact that we had pulled in as many people as we could, and we'd had about 4 rounds of testing before we went in, we found things like we had missed the workflow for referrals for elective surgery. And so people were coming with paper or placing orders inappropriately, and the entire system fell down. That was just one of the things that we found out that we missed. The problem is that once you get over that first 2 to 3 week period of hyperacute attention from IDD and from management, it's then very, very difficult to make those changes. And whichever change you think you should be making, the staff will make whatever change they think is most efficient. And the reason why that became a problem was that we had lots of downstream things that were dependent on that. So, for example, our patient flow system is dependent on people putting the correct order when they admit a patient. If you don't do that, then the flow system falls down. So I thought. What happens in practice is that all of the clever people figure out a way around it so that they can keep looking after the patient. They will do that at every stage. And if you are then trying to insert your incorrect workflow into the system by retraining, you will fail. And that's what we found early on. And so while I started out fairly authoritarian, I have ended up a Democrat by the end. I'm going to give some practical ideas of how to design things now, based around that concept of redesign is hard. In the tech literature, and whenever you go to anything to do with startups or anything to do with training of how to work in the tech industry, they all know the concept of MVP, which is minimum viable product. In IT health, we do not know MVP at all. We try and lard our systems up with as much as we can. And there's a number of incentives that drive us in that direction. The first is that our vendors want to sell us more product, and the way that they sell us more product is by selling us more modules and making sure that we use the modules that we purchased. From our management, we see the same incentive because they have just spent a lot of money on various things that sounded very good in a meeting, but in practice can be more hindrance than help. And so while everyone is standing there asking you not should we use this part of the system, but how are we going to use this part of the system, you end up spending a lot of time and attention on things that are not necessary and will often fall down a couple of weeks in. That was partially our referral system, many parts of what we call interactive use, so our nursing documentation. If we run a report, I guess about 50% of those will have had any documentation over the period of time since we went live, and how useful they are, highly variable, depends on the piece. I would say that respiratory rate is reliably documented, but temperature is definitely not, because it doesn't get displayed properly. Things that we would consider simple, like stool output or sputum, are the number one thing that people come and tap me on the shoulder. It's kind of a gag around the department now to ask me about sputum, because it's not included in the areas where people are looking, yet it's incredibly important for looking after patients. What happened to it? Well, it got stuck in a giant spreadsheet type environment, and is practically impossible for people to find, because it's like the 20th line item on a 50-line item list. It made sense when we were looking at it on a spreadsheet in the design phase. It makes no sense to the clinicians now. How could we have done that differently? Well, we could have looked at only the bare minimum. So we should not be larding up with a million alerts and rules when we don't have the input phase correct. And many of the reports that we are now trying to generate, we're trying to generate it on data where we have no concept of what the quality of that data is. And so we get the appearance of precision, but no concept of quality. So what's the minimum viable product in an ICU? I would argue that data input needs to be slick. And that's because my nursing colleagues will spend a majority of their time putting data into Cerner. Whether that stuff makes sense, whether it's in the right spot, is variable. Some of that is automated, and I think that automating as much as is reasonable with as few interactions from a human while maintaining data quality is really important. We went live with data from monitors and ventilators because we knew that that was the stuff that would take nurses a lot of time. Despite the fact that we use a lot of ECMO devices and they could go in, that's two numbers that you need to look after that therapy. And so the amount of time that we would spend getting that working would not justify the amount of time reduction for the nursing staff. Data review is really important, and this is where a lot of these systems fall down, and this is where our system is probably at its weakest. You need to be able to tell what is happening with this patient right now and what has happened with this patient across their admission. For systems where the data doesn't carry between the ward and within the ICU, that can be a huge challenge. Ours does, and so we get a nice view of what's gone on with the patient, but all of the parts of it are all over the place. We need to be able to bring that stuff together so that you can figure out an integrated path for the patient. Snapshot is underappreciated of what's going on right now. We often think of that in terms of checklists, but a lot of that data really needs to be pulled front and centre. Our system is designed by the engineers who produced it, and all of their functionality brings together bits of data that works together technically. So for example, medications data is all held together, but it's really hard to get medication data and physiological data together, and that's one of the key things that we do in an ICU. Clinical documentation needs to be swish, and it needs to make sense for where you're working. The big American vendors are giving you templates that are designed for systems where it's all based on insurance and legality and very difficult to figure out what's going on with the patient. Within the ICU, it needs to be story-based and it needs to give you an interpretation of what's going on. Medications is variable as to whether that's part of the minimum viable product, but it adds a lot of complexity that you are not in control of, particularly when it comes down to statutory requirements for making medication orders legal. And insist on iteration, particularly with your groups outside and with yourself. The first bite of the cherry can't be the last one. You've got to be able to come back. An EMR is not a one-year project. It is a rest of the hospital's lifespan project. It needs constant attention, and it needs to be able to, more often than not, cut things out, not add things. And so for us, for the next 12 months, most of my attention is going to be spent on removing things from the EMR that don't need to be there and resisting the urge from all of the people who work with our patients to add in additional things like alerting and clinician decision support. Because I would argue that until we've got that data input and the data review perfect, adding additional things is just noise. Thank you.